The sun was setting over Los Angeles International Airport as passengers lined up for a non-stop flight to New York. Among them was Steven Seagal, a man whose calm presence always drew quiet attention. Dressed simply in black jeans, a fitted hoodie, and dark shades, he looked like any other traveler, except he wasn't. Few knew that the man standing in line was a billionaire investor, a philanthropist, and one of the few who had earned both power and humility in equal measure. As the flight attendants began scanning boarding passes, Steven waited patiently, earbuds in, nodding softly to a blues track. He never used his wealth or fame to demand attention. To him, respect wasn't taken. It was given. When he finally stepped into the first-class cabin, he smiled slightly at the window seat labeled 1A, his reserved spot. But his calm expression shifted when he noticed something strange. Someone was already sitting there. A middle-aged white man, dressed in an expensive blazer and gold watch, was comfortably reclined sipping champagne. Steven paused politely. "Excuse me, sir," he said evenly. "I believe that's my seat." The man glanced at him from behind his sunglasses, then smirked. "I think you're mistaken," he said, leaning back. "This is 1A. Maybe you should check your ticket again." Steven remained composed. He held up his boarding pass and the words Seat 1A printed clearly. The flight attendant approached, glancing between the two men, uncertain, but before she could speak, the seated man scoffed. "Come on, you can't possibly afford this seat. Economy's that way." He gestured dismissively toward the back of the plane. Gasps rippled through the nearby passengers. The flight attendant's face turned pale, realizing what had just been said. Steven's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger but in quiet disbelief. He had dealt with prejudice before, but never this boldly, this publicly. Still, his voice stayed calm. "Sir, there's been a misunderstanding. Let's not make this uncomfortable for anyone." But the man only laughed. "Uncomfortable? You have no idea who you're talking to." Steven gave a faint, knowing smile. "Neither do you." What Steven did next had the entire plane staring in silence. The air in the cabin turned heavy. Every passenger in first class could feel the tension between the two men. The arrogant passenger smirked confidently, swirling his champagne like a villain in slow motion. The flight attendant, a young woman named Rachel, nervously checked her tablet. Her eyes widened slightly when she saw the name, Steven Seagal, printed clearly beside seat 1A. She turned toward the seated man. "Sir, I'm sorry, but according to our manifest, this seat is reserved for Mr. Seagal." The man didn't even look at her. "That's impossible. I booked this seat weeks ago." "Check again." Rachel swallowed hard and double-checked, scrolling rapidly. "No, sir. Your boarding pass says 2B right behind Mr. Seagal's assigned seat." The man scoffed. "That's ridiculous. I paid good money for this. I'm not moving because of some clerical error, or because some random guy thinks he's special." Steven stood silently, holding his duffel bag in one hand. The entire first-class cabin had gone quiet. Phones were out, cameras subtly recording. A woman in the next row whispered to her husband, "Why is he being so rude?" Rachel looked to Steven helplessly, as if asking him what to do. He simply gave a small nod and said softly, "It's all right. Let's not turn this into a scene." He set his bag down and waited patiently, never raising his voice, never demanding authority. But the seated man wasn't done. "You know what's wrong with people like you?" he said with a cold smirk. "You think the rules don't apply just because you've got attitude. First class isn't for everyone." The words hit like a slap. A few passengers exchanged shocked looks. Rachel froze, unsure whether to intervene or call security. Steven slowly removed his sunglasses, his calm eyes locking onto the man's. "There's no need to talk down to anyone," Steven said evenly. "We all paid to be here. Let's treat each other with respect." The man chuckled mockingly. "Respect? You don't earn that just by showing up, buddy." Rachel's voice trembled slightly as she stepped in. "Sir, I'll have to ask you to please move to your assigned seat before we can depart." But the man waved her off. "I'm not moving. You people always make mistakes with seating. This is mine now." The cabin fell into stunned silence. The audacity was unreal. Meanwhile, Steven stayed motionless, a statue of patience. His restraint only amplified the tension, like the calm before a storm. The more composed he stayed, the more uncomfortable everyone else became. In the back, a businessman muttered, "Unbelievable." If that were me, I'd have snapped already. Another whispered, "Why isn't the crew doing something?" Rachel stepped aside to contact the head attendant, whispering urgently into her radio. Stephen simply exhaled and took a seat across the aisle, refusing to escalate the situation. The arrogant passenger grinned smugly, thinking he had won. "Smart move," he said under his breath. "You're lucky I'm in a good mood." But Stephen didn't even look at him. His calm was unnerving. He knew better than anyone. Silence is louder than shouting. Minutes ticked by. Passengers shifted in their seats, eyes darting between the stubborn man and Stephen. The plane's engines began to hum in preparation for departure, but something felt wrong. Rachel hadn't returned yet. Stephen closed his eyes as if meditating. To him, this wasn't about ego, and it was about principle. He had faced worse than arrogance. Still, part of him couldn't ignore the subtle pain in the eyes of those watching, especially the young passengers who were witnessing a blatant act of disrespect. In his mind, Stephen thought, every child here is learning from this moment. Let them see dignity, not anger. Finally, the head flight attendant arrived with Rachel beside her. She leaned down toward the man in 1A. "Sir, I'm afraid you'll need to move immediately. Your ticket is for 2B. If you refuse, we'll have to involve the captain." The man leaned back, completely unfazed. "Do whatever you have to. I'm not moving." The flight attendant turned toward the intercom, her face pale. "Captain, we have a non-compliant passenger in first class. Requesting instruction." The entire cabin froze. Stephen remained seated, his hands clasped calmly on his lap. Not a single word from him, but his quiet authority filled the room. The man, sensing the growing attention, turned toward Stephen again. "What, you think you're better than me? Sitting there all quiet like some saint?" Stephen opened his eyes slowly, looked him in the eye, and said softly, "Better? No, just different. I know when to speak, and when to let someone expose themselves." The words cut deeper than any argument could. A few passengers couldn't help but clap quietly. The man scowled, muttering under his breath. Meanwhile, a voice echoed through the cabin speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. We are experiencing a short delay while our crew resolves a situation. Thank you for your patience." Everyone knew exactly what that situation was. Rachel returned and leaned toward Stephen. "Mr. Seagal, we're handling it. Please stay comfortable." He nodded once, then turned slightly toward the window, his reflection calm but unreadable. The arrogant man smirked again, but this time his confidence wavered. Something told him this wasn't going to end the way he thought. Have you ever seen someone's arrogance backfire right in front of you? Comment below, and tell us which country and city you're watching from. We love hearing from our global viewers. The hum of the airplane's engines became the only sound inside the tense first-class cabin. Every passenger's eyes darted between the stubborn man in 1A and the calm, silent figure seated just across the aisle, Steven Seagal. Flight attendants whispered among themselves, trying to decide what to do. Rachel, the young attendant, looked shaken. She'd dealt with angry customers before, but this felt different, heavier. The disrespect in the air wasn't just about a seat. It was about something deeper. Stephen could feel it too. He wasn't angry, but the words still lingered in his mind. "You people don't belong in first class." It wasn't new. He had faced prejudice before. But this time he felt the weight of all the eyes watching him. He knew how moments like these traveled, from one phone camera to a million screens. The captain's voice came over the intercom again. "Cabin crew, please stand by. We're addressing a seating issue. We'll be departing shortly." But there was no shortly. Rachel returned, her face pale. "Sir," she said quietly to the man in 1A, "if you don't comply, we'll have to escort you off the plane. Please move to seat 2B so we can depart." The man didn't even glance up. "I told you, I'm not moving. This seat's mine now. He can find another one." Rachel bit her lip and looked toward Stephen apologetically. "Mr. Seagal, Stephen raised a hand gently. "It's okay," he said in a voice so calm it silenced the entire cabin. "I don't want to cause trouble." "Let the man sit," the arrogant passenger chuckled smugly. "See? Even he knows his place." That line, that cruel, careless line, hit the cabin like a lightning bolt. The woman in seat 1B gasped. A man across the aisle shook his head in disbelief. Stephen's eyes lifted slowly toward the man, his calm demeanor unwavering, though a faint shadow passed across his expression. My place, he repeated softly as if tasting the words. Then after a pause, he said, respect doesn't come from where you sit. It comes from how you treat people. The words were simple, but they landed hard. The cabin grew deathly quiet again. Rachel blinked back tears of frustration. She was grateful he'd spoken up. The man, however, leaned forward in his seat and sneered.
You think you're teaching me something?
Save your speeches. I've worked my whole life for this seat. People like you. He stopped mid-sentence as Stephen slowly stood. For a brief second, you could hear a pin drop. Stephen towered over him, his presence calm but commanding. Not aggressive, not loud, just powerful. I've worked my whole life too, Stephen said evenly. But I learned something long ago. When you use power to belittle others, you show weakness, not strength. The man shifted uncomfortably, glancing around as if realizing for the first time that dozens of eyes were locked on him, judging him. Rachel stepped closer, holding her ground now. Sir, please cooperate. This is your final warning. But the man still muttered under his breath. Unbelievable. Now I'm being ganged up on because I stood my ground. Stephen turned to Rachel and said gently, please don't worry. I can wait. I'm not in a hurry. I just want everyone to be treated with dignity. That single sentence, when spoken with composure and kindness, earned quiet applause from a few passengers. The arrogant man's face flushed red. He could feel control slipping away. He tried to bark back, but his voice cracked. What are you all clapping for? You don't even know him. A man from row 3 spoke up. We don't have to. We just know what's right. Rachel's radio crackled. A firm voice from the cockpit said, Ground control's been notified. We'll resolve this before departure. The arrogant passenger finally sensed something shifting. The confidence in his smirk began to fade. The woman beside him got up, whispering, I don't want to be part of this. She moved to another seat. Stephen sat back down quietly, eyes closed again as if meditating. The cameras kept rolling. Every single person on that plane knew. They were witnessing something that would soon go viral. Even those in economy had started craning their necks toward first class, sensing the standoff. The minutes dragged on like hours. The captain hadn't given clearance to push back from the gate. The crew was waiting for ground security, and tension filled the air like static. The arrogant passenger adjusted his collar nervously, realizing that his victory might be short-lived. Every move he made was now being recorded. Every word was documented, and across from him, Stephen Seagal sat still as stone, patient, unshaken and perfectly in control. At that moment, Rachel glanced at Stephen and whispered, Sir, how are you staying so calm? Stephen opened his eyes slightly, gave her a faint smile and said, Because anger makes fools loud, but wisdom stays quiet. She nodded, whispering back, You're a better man than most. Stephen looked toward the window, where the last bit of sunlight hit the wing. He didn't reply. He didn't need to. The arrogant passenger fidgeted again, his nerves showing. Somewhere deep inside he knew the man he had mocked might be far more powerful than he imagined. If you were in Stephen's place, would you stay calm or confront the man directly? Tell us in the comments below. And what would you do if someone stole your seat on a plane? The cabin was silent except for the occasional hum of the engines and the restless shuffle of passengers trying to process what they'd just witnessed. The air felt heavy, almost electric, as if everyone knew something big was about to happen. Stephen Seagal sat quietly, eyes half closed, posture straight, breathing steady. His calm energy contrasted sharply with the nervous tapping of the arrogant passenger's fingers on the armrest. The man's confidence had started to fade, and for the first time, doubt flickered in his eyes. He glanced around, whispering to no one in particular, This is ridiculous. Why is everyone staring? A woman 2 seats behind him muttered softly, Maybe because you're disrespecting the wrong person. He turned sharply, scowling. Excuse me? And who exactly is he supposed to be? The woman leaned forward slightly, her voice almost conspiratorial. You really don't recognize him? The man blinked. Recognize who? A young passenger across the aisle, a college student wearing headphones around his neck, joined in. That's Stephen Seagal. The man frowned, confused. The actor? The student shook his head. Not just that. He's a billionaire investor now, owns several tech companies, charities, and schools. He's known for helping low-income communities and rebuilding housing projects across the country. Whispers started spreading like wildfire. Passengers leaned over their seats, murmuring in disbelief. A woman pulled up a photo on her phone and turned the screen toward others. Look, and it's him. The same guy. Same jacket, same shades. That's Steven Seagal. The arrogant passenger's face went pale. No, that can't be, but it was too late. The truth had already rippled through the cabin. Every seat seemed to buzz with recognition, like a current passing through metal. Rachel, the flight attendant, froze when she heard his name. Her eyes widened as memories flooded back. She'd seen his face in Forbes magazine just last month, listed among America's top 10 black philanthropists. The man in 1A swallowed hard, realizing the gravity of what he'd done. He had just humiliated a man who could buy the entire airline if he wanted to. Yet Steven hadn't thrown a single insult, hadn't raised his voice, hadn't even demanded the seat back. Instead, he'd chosen dignity over dominance. Rachel took a step closer to Steven, speaking softly. Mr. Seagal, I didn't realize. I'm so sorry for how this has been handled. We should have... Steven lifted a hand calmly, stopping her mid-sentence. No need to apologize. You did your job. It's not your fault how others choose to behave. His voice was calm, measured, like someone used to commanding a room without ever shouting. The arrogant passenger finally spoke, though his tone had changed drastically. Mr. Seagal, I didn't know who you were. If I had known... Steven looked at him steadily. If you had known, you would have acted differently? The man hesitated, caught off guard by the question. Well, I mean, I wouldn't have... Steven nodded slowly. That's the problem. The man looked down, his arrogance dissolving like mist under sunlight. The silence that followed was thick with shame. Even those who had said nothing during the confrontation were now visibly uncomfortable, realizing they'd let the situation unfold without speaking up. Steven's calm authority had done something remarkable. It had shifted the entire atmosphere without a single threat or raised word. Rachel turned toward the intercom, whispering instructions to the cabin crew. They were still grounded. The captain had refused to take off until the matter was resolved. Meanwhile, a few passengers began recording again. But this time, it wasn't just about conflict. It was about respect. They wanted the world to see how power could be quiet and justice could be calm. A teenage boy in row 5 whispered to his mother, "Mom, that's the guy who built those schools in Africa, right?" She nodded. "Yes, baby. He's the one." Even in the face of humiliation, Steven's patience had become a lesson in humility for everyone on board. Then, something unexpected happened. An older man, perhaps in his 60s, stood up from seat 2C. "Mr. Seagal," he said respectfully, "I remember when you spoke at the Global Business Forum in New York. You said something that stuck with me. When someone disrespects you, they reveal their character, not yours. You just proved that again." Steven smiled faintly and nodded. "That's kind of you to remember." The entire cabin seemed to breathe again. Some passengers clapped quietly, others just watched in awe. The arrogant man in 1A looked utterly defeated, unable to meet Steven's eyes. He fidgeted with his hands, mumbling, "I didn't mean any harm." Steven finally stood up, stretching slightly. He placed a hand on the man's shoulder, not harshly but firmly. "Apologies mean more when they're followed by change," he said softly. "Make sure this moment teaches you something." The man nodded slowly, speechless. At that instant, a flight officer entered the cabin, alerted by the captain. His sharp eyes scanned the situation. "Is everything under control here?" Steven nodded politely. "Yes, officer, it's handled." The officer looked between Steven and the trembling man in 1A, then recognized Steven instantly. His posture changed instantly, professional yet respectful. "Mr. Seagal, I apologize for the inconvenience." Steven shook his hand calmly. "No harm done. Just a lesson learned." The officer nodded, and the murmurs resumed as passengers whispered among themselves, still processing what they had witnessed. Steven sat back down, calm as ever, but the atmosphere around him had changed. What began as humiliation had transformed into admiration. The arrogant man stared ahead, face red with shame, as Stephen leaned back and looked out the window. Not smug, not proud, just peaceful. And as the engines roared to life, someone whispered from the back of the plane, "Now that's how a real man handles power." The engines hummed softly as the captain's voice came over the intercom once again. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a slight delay. Thank you for your patience." But inside the cabin, there was no patience, only anticipation. Everyone knew something was about to happen. The arrogant passenger in seat 1A sat stiffly, red-faced and fidgeting. He avoided Stephen's gaze, though the guilt in his eyes betrayed him. Around them, passengers whispered, phones tilted discreetly in record mode. Every second was being captured. Every breath, every stare, every word. Stephen had remained quiet for several minutes, his calm demeanor somehow more powerful than any argument. But now, as the flight attendant finished her report to the captain and security officers waited at the front, Stephen slowly stood. The movement alone drew instant silence. Even the children on board stopped whispering. He turned slightly, facing the arrogant passenger, but then his eyes swept across the cabin, including everyone in it. His voice was deep and steady, carrying the weight of experience and wisdom. "You know," he began, "I've been flying all my life, different airlines, different countries. But every time something like this happens, it reminds me of a truth we keep forgetting." No one spoke. The arrogant man shifted uncomfortably but didn't interrupt. Stephen continued, "It's not about where you sit, it's about who you are when you sit there. You can buy a ticket in first class, but that doesn't make you first class. Your character does." The words hit hard, direct but not angry, powerful but not cruel. He glanced toward the man beside him. "You assumed I didn't belong here because of how I look. But what you don't realize is, you didn't just insult me. You insulted every hardworking person who's ever been judged by appearance instead of effort." The arrogant man's lips parted, but no words came. Stephen's tone softened slightly. "I didn't build my life by putting others down. I built it by lifting others up. That's what real power looks like." A murmur of agreement swept through the cabin. People began nodding. Some clapped softly, others just listened with their phones still raised. Stephen looked toward Rachel, the flight attendant who had tried to keep the peace. "You did your best under pressure," he said gently. "And I respect that. You stayed professional, even when it wasn't easy." Rachel blinked, visibly emotional. "Thank you, sir," she whispered. Stephen turned back to the rest of the passengers. "I know everyone wants to get where they're going, but maybe, just maybe, this flight isn't grounded because of a seating issue. Maybe it's grounded because we needed to learn something before taking off." A few people smiled, nodding in understanding. He paused for a moment, then added, "I've been fortunate in my life. Wealth, success, fame. But none of that means anything if you forget where you came from. And I'll never forget." The cabin was utterly still. His words weren't loud, but they carried further than shouting ever could. Then he turned to the man again, his voice steady and direct. "Sir, I accept your apology, Kvunner, even if you haven't said it yet. Because I don't need your words to find peace. I hope you'll remember this moment, not because you embarrassed yourself, but because you have a chance to do better." The man finally looked up, eyes watery, voice trembling. I'm sorry," he muttered. Stephen nodded slightly. "Thank you. That's a good start." A few people began to clap, quietly at first, then louder. It spread through the cabin like a wave. The sound filled the space that had moments ago been filled with tension and shame. Rachel wiped away a tear as she turned to the captain's cabin. "It's resolved," she said softly into her mic. "We're ready for takeoff." But the captain responded with a tone of caution. "Hold position. Ground control wants a statement before departure." Stephen raised an eyebrow, then smiled faintly. "Seems like this flight really is grounded." Laughter broke out, nervous but real. The ice had been broken. The arrogant passenger slumped in his seat, visibly humbled. For the first time since boarding, he looked less like a man in control and more like a man reflecting on his own actions. Stephen sat back down calmly, folding his hands, as cameras continued recording. He didn't mind. He knew the world needed to see that power didn't have to come from shouting or revenge. Sometimes silence, followed by truth, was louder than any punch. Minutes later, Rachel came by again. "Mr. Seagal," she said quietly, "that was incredible. People are saying it's the most powerful thing they've ever witnessed on a flight." Stephen smiled humbly. If it helps someone think twice before judging, then it's worth it. As she turned to walk away, a voice called out from behind, a passenger in row 5. "Sir, can I ask something?" Stephen nodded. The young man stood. "If you had lost your temper, no one would have blamed you. But you didn't. How do you stay so calm when people disrespect you like that?" Stephen paused thoughtfully. "Because I've learned that when someone disrespects you, they're revealing who they are, not who you are. Anger only gives them power over you. Calm takes it back." The cabin erupted in another wave of applause. Some even stood. Rachel's voice cracked through the intercom again, trying not to laugh. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're preparing for departure after the most unforgettable boarding in airline history." Stephen chuckled softly, leaning back in his seat. He wasn't smiling because of pride. He was smiling because peace had won. As the plane finally taxied down the runway, he whispered to himself, "Respect. That's the real first class." The engines began to rumble again, but the flight still didn't move. The captain's voice came over the intercom one last time, firm but uneasy. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've been asked to remain grounded for a few more minutes. Thank you for your patience." The passengers exchanged glances. Everyone knew why they weren't moving. Word had already started spreading beyond the cabin. Dozens of phones were still recording, live streaming what had just happened. Clips of Stephen's calm confrontation were already hitting social media, uploaded before the plane even left the runway. One video, captioned "Man tries to steal seat from black billionaire, instantly regrets it," was already gaining thousands of views in real time. Rachel, the flight attendant, scrolled through her device wide-eyed. "It's going viral," she whispered to Stephen. "People are sharing it everywhere." "You're trending." Stephen smiled softly, but his tone was humble. "Then let's hope they learn something good from it." Meanwhile, the arrogant passenger sat in silence, staring blankly ahead. The confident smirk he once wore had completely vanished. Sweat gathered at his temples as whispers filled the cabin around him. "Can you believe he said that to Steven Seagal?" Someone whispered. "Man, that's going to ruin him," another replied. The man's fingers fidgeted nervously against the armrest. He finally muttered, almost to himself, "I didn't mean for it to go that far." Stephen glanced at him, his expression calm but firm. "The problem with disrespect," he said quietly, "is that it always goes further than you think." The man swallowed hard, realizing there was no undoing what had happened. Just then, a security officer entered the cabin. He was tall, serious, and clearly briefed about the incident. "Mr. Seagal," he said respectfully, "the captain's requested confirmation. Are you comfortable continuing the flight?" Stephen nodded. "Yes, everything's fine now." "The lesson's been learned." The officer turned to the arrogant passenger. "Sir, I need you to understand your behavior was unacceptable. You're lucky Mr. Seagal didn't press charges." The man looked up, stunned. "Charges?" Stephen raised a hand. "No, I don't want that. Let him stay. He deserves the journey, just not the comfort." The officer nodded respectfully. "Understood, sir." The murmurs in the cabin grew louder. Everyone knew Stephen could have had the man escorted off the plane, humiliated even further. But instead he chose compassion. That only deepened the respect people felt for him. Rachel placed a gentle hand on Stephen's shoulder. "You really are one of a kind." Stephen gave a faint smile. "Kindness is free. Too many people forget that." As the plane finally began to taxi forward, the tension slowly melted into admiration. Passengers who had been silent earlier now felt the urge to speak. "Mr. Seagal," a woman across the aisle said softly, "thank you for how you handled that. My kids just learned more from watching you than any classroom could ever teach." Stephen nodded warmly. Then maybe this flight wasn't delayed for nothing. Her young son peeked over the seat and waved shyly. "You're really cool, mister." Stephen chuckled. "Thanks, little man. You stay that way, humble and strong." Laughter rippled through the cabin, breaking the heaviness that had loomed minutes before. But in the back rows, several passengers were still glued to their phones. The story had exploded online. News outlets were already picking it up. Headlines flashed across screens. Black billionaire humiliated by passenger responds with unshakable grace. Steven Seagal turns racism into a masterclass in respect. Flight drama goes viral, the calm that grounded a plane. Within minutes, comments flooded in from across the world. This man's composure is legendary. America needs more people like Steven Seagal. He handled racism with dignity, not revenge, respect. Proud moment for every person of color who's ever been judged. The world was watching in real time. Meanwhile, the arrogant passenger slowly removed his sunglasses, staring at the phone screen of the woman across from him, his own face staring back at him in a viral clip. He looked sick. He whispered to Rachel, Can you ask him to take it down?" Rachel shook her head. "No one's taking anything down, sir. The world's already seen it." The man sank deeper into his seat, realizing this flight wouldn't just end when they landed, it would follow him long after. Steven, sensing his remorse, leaned over slightly. "You don't need to run from this," he said gently. "Just make sure the man you are tomorrow is better than the one you were today." The man nodded weakly, whispering, "You're right. I was wrong. I'm sorry." Steven nodded once. "Then we're good." Silence followed, but this time it was peaceful. No more tension, no more hostility, just quiet respect. As the plane lifted off the runway, the cabin lights dimmed and the world below faded into a sea of clouds. Rachel made her final round, smiling at passengers, her voice steady but warm. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said over the intercom, "we are now airborne. Thank you for your patience and for reminding us that respect costs nothing, but it means everything." The cabin erupted in soft applause. Steven looked out the window, the city lights shrinking below. His reflection stared back, calm, grounded, and unbothered. He whispered to himself, "Peace always wins in the end." At that moment, his phone buzzed. A message from his PR manager lit up the screen. "You're trending in 42 countries. Everyone's calling you the man who grounded hate." Steven smiled faintly, locked his phone, and leaned back. "Let them talk," he murmured. "Maybe they'll finally start listening too." If this story was you, would you have stayed calm like Steven or called security right away? Comment below what city and country you're watching from, and type respect if you believe calm is stronger than anger. By the time the plane touched down at JFK Airport, the story had already traveled farther than the aircraft itself. The moment the wheels hit the runway, every phone on board buzzed. Notifications, messages, headlines. The incident that started with one stolen seat had become a global conversation. Steven Seagal remained quiet as always, watching from his window seat as flashes from the terminal windows reflected against the glass. He didn't need to speak, the world was doing it for him. As the passengers began to disembark, several stopped by his seat. "Mr. Seagal, you handled that like a true gentleman," said a businessman in a gray suit. A woman added softly, "You gave my teenage daughter hope that kindness can still win." Even Rachel, the flight attendant, paused with tears in her eyes. "Sir, thank you for reminding us that calm doesn't mean weakness." Steven simply smiled. "It never does." When he finally stood and walked off the plane, the same arrogant passenger, now pale and speechless, stood aside to let him pass. His eyes were full of regret. Steven paused just long enough to look at him and say quietly, "Redemption doesn't come from running away from mistakes. It comes from owning them." The man nodded, whispering, "I'll remember that." Steven gave him a simple nod, then walked calmly down the jet bridge, his presence commanding even in silence. By the time he reached baggage claim, reporters were already waiting. Cameras flashed, microphones rose. "Mr. Seagal, is it true you were racially profiled on your flight? Are you pressing charges? What message do you have for the world after what happened?" Steven stopped for a moment, removing his sunglasses. His expression was calm, the same calm that had silenced an entire plane. "I'm not here to shame anyone," he said. "I'm here to remind people that power isn't about shouting louder than others. It's about standing taller in silence." The reporters grew quiet. Even they could feel it. His words weren't rehearsed. They were real. "Respect," he continued. is something we owe each other no matter the seat we sit in, the color of our skin, or the title we hold. We all share the same sky. Let's learn to fly under it together. The clip aired that evening, and within hours it broke the internet. Hashtags exploded across every platform. Respect over rage. Man who grounded hate. Steven Seagal celebrities, athletes, and influencers shared his quote. Schools discussed it. News anchors praised it. Even political leaders referenced it in speeches about equality and dignity. And somewhere, in a quiet apartment across town, the man who had stolen Steven's seat sat watching the broadcast, humbled. He stared at the TV as Steven's calm, steady words filled the room. Then, after a long silence, he reached for his phone and typed out a public apology. "I made a terrible mistake. I judged a man by his skin, not his soul. Mr. Seagal showed me grace I didn't deserve. I'll spend the rest of my life living up to that lesson." That post alone was shared over 2 million times. The comments weren't hateful. They were forgiving. People saw redemption, not just punishment. As days passed, airlines began revising their crew training policies, emphasizing empathy, equality, and passenger dignity. The story wasn't just a viral moment. It became a movement. A month later, Steven was invited to speak at a global leadership summit. His talk was simple yet unforgettable. The plane didn't get grounded because of hate, he said. It got grounded because the world needed to remember how to rise again, not with anger, but with understanding. The crowd rose in a standing ovation. When he stepped off stage, his assistant handed him a tablet. "Sir," she said, smiling, "that flight video just crossed 200 million views." Steven chuckled softly. "Good," he said. "Now let's hope 200 million hearts learned something." 2. He walked out of the hall, sunglasses on, hands in pockets, the same calm, composed energy he had that day on the plane. Outside, reporters shouted his name. Flashes went off, but he didn't stop. He just smiled and said quietly, "Respect. That's the only seat worth fighting for." If you believe no one should be judged by appearance, type respect in the comments. Tell us which city and country you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring true stories like this one, where calm wins over chaos and dignity defeats hate.